Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, ladies and gentlemen, wherever you might be. I'm Dr. John Duke Anthony, the founding president and chief executive officer of the National Council on U.S. Arab Relations. Welcome to the ongoing series of what we like to refer to at the National Council as a cerebral massage. Where we think out of the box, we analyze out of the box, we have critical thinking out of the box, we come up with implications, ramifications pertaining to substance, to approaches, to policies, to positions, to actions, to attitudes, pertaining to what? Pertaining in the most macro sense, America's relations with the Arab region, the Middle East, and the Islamic world. And the other way around, events and issues and challenges and opportunities in those three regions as to how they impact and have an effect on the United States and America's friends, allies, and strategic partners. At both ends of these bridges, of these links, there are a variety of constants and variables that pertain to America's needs, America's concerns, America's interests, America's goals and objectives. And likewise, they're not the exact opposite, nor are they exact similar needs, concerns, and interests, and policies and positions and actions and attitudes of our partners, of our friends, of our allies. Those we're far less in control of than our own. But even with regard to our own, we're subject to shocks and uncertainty. And here we are at a flexing point in history that, as most of the mainstream and non-mainstream news analysts and commentators refer to as the most crisis-laden and potential series of events and activities since the ending of the Second World War in 1945. Now, how are we going to unpack all that is occurring and not occurring? And as these phenomena, forces, and factors impact on America's national needs, and legitimate and aspirational needs and concerns pertaining to our own goals, foreign relations, and policies, on one hand, and those of our friends as well as our adversaries on the other. That's a lot to try to make straight or clarify and less complex. But lest there be no mistake, we are at a point of crisis, and lexicons and monikers and language and concepts behind words that are used in sentences and phrases are important, all of which, so, come into play when we try to make sense of this uncertain and sometimes seemingly senseless region with regard to certain fast-breaking phenomena. How are we going to do this? We're talking about three of the world's greatest superpowers: the United States, China, and Russia. There are similarities of needs, concerns, and interests among the three, and there are profound differences and subtleties and nuances at both. We need specialists, not anybody who's simply interested in these phenomena to express her or his perspective, point of view, and analysis. We have two of the world's finest, not just America's, not just those who specialize in the Arab region, the Middle East, and the Islamic world, but those who focus on China and the former Soviet Union, namely Russia, as well. Who are these individuals? We will be starting with David Rundell, who's a retired career U.S. Foreign Service officer who spent the overwhelming majority of his working days and time in Saudi Arabia. But he also had postings elsewhere in the Arab region, as well as in Washington. I first met David when he was in the audience at Oxford, at St. Anthony's College, where I was a guest lecturer in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And he was a student of the late Albert Hourani, Allah, may his soul rest in peace. Michael Gofella, I met him far more recently when he was a close proxy, alter ego in some ways for the office of the Vice President, Dick Cheney, in Riyadh. David Rundell is the only American career Foreign Service officer, to my knowledge, who served substantial, intensive, extensive periods of time in Riyadh, the capital, but also Jeddah and the oil patch, so to speak, in the eastern province in Dhafran. America needs and needed at the time these kinds of specialization. And David Rundell is the one who provided those specializations more than anyone I've ever known. And Michael Gofella also, in the bigger picture on the strategic implications and ramifications of America's relationships with Saudi Arabia, much envied relationship because of Saudi Arabia's pivotal role for the world's nearly 2 billion Muslims, adherents to the fastest growing monotheistic faith of the three monotheistic faiths of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Michael has written, David rather, has written a book called Vision and Mirage, having to do with Saudi Arabia. And we were pleased, pressured, and honored to have an entire session on David's views of what was coming down the track in Saudi Arabia and what the implications would be for the country itself, domestically, internal dynamics, but also bilaterally with the United States, multilaterally with the 6-country Gulf Cooperation Council, for which Saudi Arabia is the capital of the headquarters of the General Secretariat of Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia. Following David will be Michael Gofella, and Michael works closely with David on the macro and the micro. And we at the National Council try to add something on the medium between those two extremes there to unpack this situation having to do with Russia, China, Saudi Arabia, and other Arab, Middle Eastern, Islamic countries, and how they are impacting the so-called fast breaking news having to do with the Ukraine, having to do with Russia, and having to do with China. We have a lot to focus on here. Each will speak for 15 minutes, and then I will fire questions at them that are being funneled to me by listeners and viewers. First off, David Rundell.
Thank you, Dr. Anthony. It's always a pleasure to speak to you and your interested group, which we can assume are quite well informed about the Middle East. So some of the things I will talk about today require a little bit of background, and I think most of the people in your audience have it. Yeah. The first thing to say, though, is that the world still runs on oil. I think there's an increasing belief that that somehow is a past era. The truth is that 30% of global energy still comes from oil. 80% still comes from hydrocarbons. And when you talk about transportation, fuel oil and gasoline and jet fuel and heavy oil for ships, 90% of that now still comes from, over 90% comes from oil. So the world runs on oil, and the increase in oil prices, which we're seeing now, is a tax. It is a tax on everything and everybody, and it particularly affects those who are less well off. in particular, those people who a substantial part of their income is spent on transportation. And there are people like that. There are people who, spend a substantial amount of their income driving to work. So these are real issues for the American people. This is not something that is the realm of think tanks and academics. So what I wanted to talk about today is a profound change in the way the oil markets are operating today. And we have talked about that in terms of a new axis of oil. And the axis of oil that we're speaking about is the two largest exporters, Saudi Arabia and Russia, and the largest importer, China. This is probably the third transition in the global oil market. The first was in the 70s when the international oil companies, the Seven Sisters, who had dominated the industry for decades, were displaced by OPEC. OPEC's importance has waxed and waned over the years. I think you could argue that to some extent it was waning until King Salman and his son, Mohammed bin Salman, if you will, resurrected OPEC, reinvigorated OPEC, revitalized OPEC, whatever you want to call it, by creating something called OPEC Plus, which includes Russia. So between the two of them, they have by far the largest share of not only production. The United States has production, but they have exportable oil. And so in the global marketplace, they are very significant. They also have excess capacity, particularly Saudi Arabia, which can be turned on and off by fiat. That's significant. The United States may have excess capacity over time, but there are dozens, in fact, hundreds of independent producers in the United States who don't take their orders from Washington. One phone call from the king will change Saudi oil production by hundreds of thousands of barrels a day. Putin can't do it quite as dramatically as that, but he still has a great deal more influence over far fewer producers than exist in the United States. So this alliance, which took quite a bit of diplomatic skill to negotiate, and I think that's something that we need to remember, that the Saudis did this, and it is an achievement that they have dramatically increased their role in oil markets again by bringing the Russians in, and they do not want to see that hard work dissipated. So, and that is very relevant because they have, again, you listeners know that there is an OPEC agreement, an OPEC plus agreement that will increase oil production by 500,000 barrels, 400,000 barrels actually a month for the next several months. And when the United States asked them to accelerate that and thereby break the agreement, which they had negotiated with all of their OPEC partners, they declined. That's not usual. They have in the past often been much more accommodating to American interests. So I think it's important to understand that there's an alliance now, or a partnership between Russia and Saudi Arabia. There is also a partnership between Saudi Arabia and China. China is Saudi Arabia's largest trading partner and also Aramco's largest customer, both for crude oil and for petrochemicals, which is another major Saudi export. Saudi Arabia has significant investments in China, in refining and increasingly in petrochemicals. So this is an economic relationship that is of great importance to the Saudis. China is also important to Saudi Arabia in a military sense, Russia less so, but China is the country that has provided Saudi Arabia with ballistic missiles and with the capability or the technology to begin manufacturing those missiles domestically. And both China and Russia also have a strategic position in the Middle East, which allows them to influence Iran, which is Saudi Arabia's, if you will, in their mind, their archenemy, their nemesis, the country that they feel is most threatening to them. Russia sits on the border of Iran, has some agreements with them relating to nuclear wastes, and has occupied parts of Iran in the past. That's not something that's happened recently, but they are a neighbor, close neighbor. And China is the country that still buys a great deal of Iranian oil. And so the Iranians, I think it's fair to say, listen to the Chinese when they say to them, perhaps it wasn't a good idea to have a drone attack on Abqaiq. Perhaps that might disrupt some of our supplies that we get from Saudi Arabia as well. And the United States has very little influence on Iran. So I think that there are numerous reasons why the Saudis and the Russians and the Saudis and the Chinese form two legs of this triangle. The third leg is clearly the Chinese-Russian leg. Mike can talk about that with more expertise than I can. He is a certified, he's the only person in the State Department with a native speaking ability in both Arabic and Russian. So I'll let him address Russia more than myself, but I'll only say that while Saudi Arabia is the biggest supplier of oil to China, Russia is a close second, and that's only increasing. At the Olympics, Putin and Xi announced that they would increase by about 25% natural gas exports from Russia to China, and by about 12.5% the oil exports. So those two are closely linked at the hip in terms of energy and also politically, because for the first time, the Chinese have expressed an opinion on the Ukraine and have expressed that they don't think it would be a good idea to have NATO expand further. And we'll be interested to see how the Chinese vote on any Security Council resolutions that come up in the next day or so related to Ukraine. So I think it's, in closing, I would simply say that demand for oil is not going away. Despite the significant efforts that are being made to promote energy transition in the United States and in Western Europe, manufacturing continues to grow in Asia. China and India are not likely to see net zero for a long time. China is not even going to start. India, for several decades, as I recall, certainly for another decade, India has said they're not going to start unless we pay them, I forget some huge sum, billions of dollars, in order to help them. And there's an argument there to be made that the West grew wealthy using cheap energy, and now when it's our turn, you want us to stay poor by switching to these less cost-effective means. And they're not terribly interested in that. China, as you probably know, is building more. They actually not building, they built more in 2020. They built more coal-fired power plants than the rest of the world put together. So the United States can do all that it wants to reduce carbon emissions. But if China continues on that path, it's not going to make a great deal of difference. In any event, the point that I'm making is that demand for oil is not going down. There are a lot of people in China and India who still walk. There are plenty who still ride bicycles. And there are plenty who would like to have a car, and it won't be a Tesla. So we'll leave it at that on terms of demand. In terms of supply, the United States was moving towards so-called energy independence. We have sought to reverse that for partly that was a result of COVID, and partly that's a result of government policy, which has placed new restrictions and costs on oil production in the United States. So this is only going to increase our reliance on foreign exporters like the Saudis. And therefore, I would argue that, that we should improve our relationship with the Saudis so that the next time we ask them for some help, we may get a more positive response. And then the final thing that I would mention that is important about this new triangle between Saudi Arabia, China, and Russia is its potential impact on the value of the dollar as a reserve currency. The United States obtains a great value from something called seigniorage, which is the profit essentially that you get from printing money that costs you a lot less to manufacture than it actually is worth. And as long as the United States remains the reserve currency for the world, we are able to pretty well securely issue more and more government debt to finance our deficits. A large element in underpinning our role as a reserve currency is the fact that it's used in international trade, and particularly in the oil market, which is a vast market. Just parenthetically, but the actual amount of oil that is traded, that is produced every day is roughly 100 million barrels. The amount that is actually traded in markets is close to 2 billion. So in other words, the financial market of trading oil is far bigger than the actual physical market. And that's done in dollars. If that ever began to change, because the Saudis decided not to denominate their oil trade in dollars, that would undermine the American dollar as a reserve currency. So that's something else to bear in mind when we think about why we would want to improve our relations with Saudi Arabia. So I think with those comments, I will turn it over to Michael, simply to say that we should bear in mind that there is a new axis in the oil markets, which is made up of players whose interests are now aligning at the same time that some of those countries are seeing their interests diverge from those of the United States.
Okay, thank you, David. It was a masterful overview within the allocated time slot. And we turn now to Michael Gofellow as a follow-on for his own range of information and insight and analysis and sharing knowledge and understanding that for many is hard to come by. Ambassador Gofellow.
Thank you, Dr. Anthony. I appreciate the opportunity to follow David's brilliant presentation. David and I were colleagues for many years in Saudi Arabia, and it's always a pleasure to interact with him again on an intellectual level. Easily one of the most brilliant people I've ever met. So let's talk about this trilateral access that has formed. I think it goes beyond the oil markets, although it's very important within the context of the oil markets. Saudi Arabia has a lot to offer. Russia, its leading role in the world of Islam is important to Russia. The second largest religion in the Russian Federation is, of course, Islam. Aside from Tatarstan, there are other large ethnic minorities in Russia that profess Islam. And of course, Russia, From our point of view, in the United States, Islam is part of the world of the East. We look eastward toward Mecca, we look eastward toward Arabia. From the Russian point of view, Islam is their southern border. They border on the Central Asian countries, they border on the Middle East. They are a geographical participant in the Middle East in a way that we often don't think about. We tend to think of Russia as an Eastern European country, but it's much more, geographically speaking, involved with the Islamic world and the Middle East as part of the Islamic world than we often realize. So, the transformation of Russia in the last 30 years from a communist dictatorship to a quasi-democracy with a semi-free economy and a country that certainly abjures its communist past has been really important in terms of the ability of Saudi Arabia and other Islamic countries to engage with Russia. When Russia was an officially communist country, the Saudis essentially had no dealings with Moscow. Now that Russia is a secular/Christian, Jewish and Muslim country, of course, the Saudis have relations, very close relations. MBS, Mohammed bin Salman's diplomacy with Deputy Prime Minister Novikov in negotiating the Saudi-Russian energy partnership was actually a brilliant example of Saudi diplomacy, as David has outlined. What attracted the Saudis and the Russians together is that each of them has an energy economy in which the government plays a key role. So they can talk to each other about production and pricing in a way they can't talk to the United States. We have a private sector economy, a private sector energy sector. And so we have thousands of producers, literally large and small, that collectively determine our output and influence the price. The United States government doesn't set energy prices and can't really. This is not true of Russia. This is not true of Saudi Arabia. And so in a situation in which Saudi Arabia, the United States, and Russia are each equally capable of producing about 12 million barrels a day, we have a situation in which a quarter of global daily oil production is under the control of the Russian and the Saudi governments. And the main point, of course, of OPEC Plus was to allow Russia, together with Saudi Arabia, to exert a decisive influence on oil production and pricing. And that's worked very well over the last 6 years, ever since September 2016, when they initiated the original OPEC Plus agreement. The negotiations have been difficult from time to time, but certainly during the COVID era, the OPEC Plus was of vital importance to both Russia's economic security and survival and Saudi Arabia's. So this is one of the strongest legs of the new trilateral arrangement. I think another issue we should pay attention to is the extent to which, since the Khashoggi incident, American elites have distanced themselves from Saudi Arabia. The Crown Prince has still not been invited by the current administration to Washington. Russian and Saudi diplomacy, on the other hand, have been very, very active. Defense Minister Shoigu was in last fall in Riyadh to offer a broad range of Russian defense services and products to the Saudis. They're looking at that carefully. The Saudis already are benefiting from Russia's expertise in manufacturing both drones and anti-drone strategies and technology. That's extremely important. Russia and Saudi Arabia essentially compete for the position of primary oil supplier to China. Each supplies 17 to 18% of China's daily oil consumption, or imports rather. The Russians, during the recent Olympic Games, negotiated an agreement with the Chinese to boost their exports by 200,000 barrels a day. If that holds, and this is a 10-year agreement with conservative pricing, so it's of great strategic importance to the Chinese as oil prices this morning go up above $105 a barrel. So very important agreement. That may give the Russians a slight edge over the Saudis this year in terms of their access to the Chinese energy market. Last year, the Saudis were exporting about 1.7 million barrels a day. This year, the Russians will probably do 1.8. So you can see how this is working out. So in a real sense, Russia and Saudi Arabia are competing for the Chinese market, but they're jointly helping to fuel China's continued prosperity and economic rise, which makes them of great importance. Now, the war in Ukraine will, of course, only increase Russia's need to sell energy to China as Western markets are are close to it. There's a limit to how much that can happen. When you look at the Russians' biggest customer in Europe, which is Germany, the Germans get a third of their oil, half their natural gas, and half their coal from Russia. So I think there are limits to the degree to which we can really sanction the Russian energy sector. Nevertheless, there will be harsh sanctions imposed on Russia for the invasion of Ukraine, which began late last night, U.S. time, early Thursday morning, Russian time. And this will, of course, push them closer and closer to the Chinese economically. In this context, I can only repeat the warnings that Dr. Henry Kissinger, a former professional associate of mine, I used to work with Kissinger Associates for several years, used to make all the time in my hearing. He would say, the greatest strategic disaster that could befall the United States and the collective West would be for Eurasia to be united in an anti-American bloc under the leadership of Russia and China. But this is exactly what's happening right now. Yep. And Saudi Arabia, as a crucial component, is being added, crucial in terms of energy security for this new bloc. We need to be very careful about this. The whole point behind Richard Nixon's trip to China decades ago was precisely to split the Soviet Union and China, prevent this type of alignment, which was viewed back then in the 70s as potentially lethal to the US and American interests. But right now, our policy willy-nilly seems to be pushing Russia in that direction. And I think we need to consider carefully whether this is really what we want to happen. This is a bigger question even than the fate of Ukraine. I'd like to address the Ukraine crisis for a second as well, because it has a direct bearing on the trilateral alliance that we're talking about, the Saudi, Russian, and Chinese alliance. In Western commentary, one often hears, in commentary written in English or German or French, that Putin's intervention in Ukraine is economically foolish, will only impose costs on him. I question that, I really do. It seems to me that if Putin succeeds with his apparent war aim of dominating southern and eastern Ukraine while leaving the West as a sort of rump Ukrainian state for NATO and the EU to take care of, he'll end up acquiring two important economic assets, important in the medium and long term. One of them, of course, is the Chernozem, the black soil regions of Ukraine. Ukraine right now is the fifth largest grains producer and exporter in the world, and Russia is the largest. So the largest food producer in the world is going to conquer the fifth largest. What will that mean in practical terms? It'll mean that Russia plus Ukraine as a single economic entity will control 25% of the global grain supply. This matters for Middle Eastern countries like Egypt and for Turkey. Turkey imports about 70% of its grain from Russia and Ukraine right now. Soon, if Putin succeeds, he'll be in control of that entire trade rather than having to compete with the Ukrainians for market share. Russia and Ukraine together account for almost all of Egypt's wheat imports. Russia is by far the larger supplier, but if Putin succeeds in conquering the farmlands of eastern Ukraine, then he'll be in control of all of it. And this is a big deal. I mean, these are concrete economic resources we're talking about, not will-o-wisp, rapidly changing financial flows, as important as they are. And then there's the whole question of the natural gas export pipeline network that was built during Soviet times and crosses all of Ukraine from east to west. Military success in Ukraine will probably give Putin control of this network as well. In the short run, the halt of gas exports to that pipeline network, of course, will drive up both natural gas and oil prices. As I noted on the news of the invasion, oil jumped to $105 a barrel this morning. I don't think that's the ceiling. So clearly these trends have big implications for the Middle East and therefore for the trilateral axis that we've been discussing. And then there's, of course, the military and security dimension of the axis. David touched on that, but I think it's important to know that Saudi Arabia is increasingly concerned by the Vienna negotiations over the renewed JCPOA, the so-called JCPOA 2.0, which are not going in a direction that the Saudis find pleasing, to put it mildly. So it's really not surprising that they've reached out to another member of this trilateral axis, China, for ballistic missile technology. Dave and I were both in Saudi Arabia in the early 1980s when the Saudis began to import ballistic missile technology from China. Now the Chinese have created a ballistic missile factory in Saudi Arabia outside of Riyadh. And so this partnership is increasing at the same time that they're trying to deal with the drone threat from Iran mediated through Houthi-controlled northern Yemen by importing Russian drone technology. So there's a trend line here in which Saudi Arabia, which feels that its security concerns are not being fully respected by its Western partners, is turning for critical military technology to Beijing and to Moscow. And that is something that ought to concern us. People often say that Saudi Arabia is too dependent on Western, particularly American military technology, to shift to another patron. But I think we need to be careful about making such assumptions. They might lull us into a false sense of security. The fact of the matter is that the prestige of the US military, and therefore of US military products and services, has fallen a great deal in the region since our withdrawal from Afghanistan. The prestige of Russian, in particular, military technology and military ability in general is increasing because of their success in Syria and backing the Assad regime. And if Putin succeeds in conquering eastern and southern Ukraine, that will add even more to the prestige of Russian arms along the whole technological spectrum from AK-47s to Su-24 fighters. So we need to be watching this space. This trilateral axis is a reality. It isn't done developing yet. And as David alluded, it could really threaten US interests at a certain point. So we need to keep our eye on it. And I would finally, as a final point, I would add that, I don't want to take up too much time here, but I think I would add that the threat to the primacy of the dollar, as David alluded to, is quite real. The Russians make no secret at all about their eagerness to develop alternatives to the dollar. Of course, their main reason is to avoid the impact of US economic sanctions, which are all based on the primacy of the dollar. But now we have this strong alliance based on energy trade and common security interest to a large degree. And will it be possible for the Chinese, the Saudis, and the Russians to work out a payment system for energy trade that doesn't involve the dollar? I would think it is possible in principle, especially if they decide to import, adopt aspects of blockchain technology to make that happen. And I would also propose that our frequent use of financial sanctions involving the dollar in recent decades has given the Chinese, the Russians, and even the Saudis an incentive to explore these options. Thank you.
Michael, that was a fantastic follow-on to David's overview and introductory remarks. We have 20 minutes here for questions and discussion. And because the questions outnumber the amount of time that could professionally and effectively be allocated to the one or the other of the two of you, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pose various questions, and you pick and choose which ones you think are the more timely, the more relevant, the more linked to misinformation, disinformation, with your permission. I'll read some of them out, and then I'll come back and ask you while you're thinking of a response of the ones that you would like to take. And you'll have ample time to let the adrenaline pump in your minds as to what would be an appropriate or an effective response from your perspective. Neither of you has mentioned the so-called One Belt, One Road strategic gambit initiative campaign of China, which is bold, which is ambitious, which is geopolitically expansionist. What are the implications of this, and how can one assess whether this is altogether a threat, a challenge to the United States, or something that the United States might benefit from or have its own alternative approach? Another one is coming down the road with Russia increasing its linkages, its ties to Iran, and even a proposal by one of the GCC countries of a tunnel that would go underground, linking southern Iran to eastern Arabia and vice versa. This is a more fast-breaking news. This is a speedy, immediate news. The implications of that, the feasibility of that, the reality of that. Another one would be how valid, how reliant, how timely, how useful, mutually beneficial is one likely to see the ongoing defense component and the United States relationship with Saudi Arabia? You made reference, David, and you too, by implication, Michael, to the Iran-based drone attack to the nerve center, the world's nerve center in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia, where the United States had no effective military response. This was a first. And then the 80-year relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia. At no point would a Saudi Arabian defense specialist have imagined or fantasized that the Saudi Arabian nerve center would be attacked and the United States would do nothing other than rhetorically condemn the attack, but do nothing to punish the attacker, namely Iran. Another one has to do with how valid and how viable is the element of trust. Trust can be everything between the United States and Saudi Arabia. Remember, after 9/11, there was almost a near cancellation of Saudi Arabians being allowed entry into the United States with the ease that had been the case for decades upon decades before. You have around 500,000, by some estimates, Saudi Arabian graduates of American institutions of higher educations. And many Saudi Arabians take their families on their vacation back to where they went to school, where mama and where papa obtained their higher education. All of this has created a kind of visceral, subjective, pro-American bias by Saudi Arabians who are grateful for the impact of the United States on their formative years of becoming educated and prepared to be leaders in that country. Is this likely to be, to use your word, David, dissipated or vitiated? We had a crossroads there as well. I remember speaking to the president of Saudi Aramco about the implications of this. And he said, John Duke, you've already lost 4,000 of us that we've been sending as students to Japan, to Korea, and to China, while you've been looking the other way because of the visceral reaction in the United States against Arabs, against Muslims. The so-called Arabophobia, Islamophobia trickled down to just several thousand. But then like a carnival, Ferris wheel, downs and ups in a marriage and a relationship. And we bounced back, Saudi Arabia bounced back, we bounced back together where more than 100,000 Saudi Arabians, if you include the dependents, came again to the United States for their high education and in pursuit of advancement there. And then perhaps you, David, on intellectual property rights, and that Saudi Arabia does not get the Olympic gold medal or standard for respecting international property rights to the degree that the United States private sector would insist, would emphasize, has to be the case for the element of trust to deepen, to heighten, to broaden as such. There. The last few questions here have to do with the security risk that you see coming to the United States. There are those who see China as a threat. And one can say, yes, it is at the global level compared to where things have been. But does any country in Arabia and the Gulf really see China at the moment, or even on the horizon, as a threat? A serious concept there versus an ascendant geopolitical player, where they're more aligned on their thinking, on their analysis, on their strategic assessment of the opportunities in issues. And then lastly, human rights. The Biden administration has indicated that it will make its foreign relations with any countries linked to a country's record in the realm of human rights. This is intrusive in any event. So this is the basket full of questions put to you. Choose any of them. They're all relevant. They're all timely. They all need an informed assessment and analysis. Either of you can go first.
Well, if I could go first, I'd like to address the elephant in the room, which really is the last question that you raised. And that is the question of human rights, and that is directly related to the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it is important that any diplomat or any administration seeks to balance a country's, and that is to say the United States, our values and our interests. And I've said before that if you abandon your values, you have nothing to defend. But if you abandon your interests, you have no way to defend your values. So when it comes to Saudi Arabia, we have both values and interests to defend, and that a total focus on one or the other is short-sighted and going to be counterproductive. So I would argue that the Iranians, for example, we are now bending over backwards to develop a better relationship with, routinely assassinate people, dissidents overseas. Okay, that doesn't really seem to get a great deal of coverage, but it happens, and a good deal of it happens in Turkey. The Saudis, on the other hand, are making profound social changes in their country. The role of women, we could talk about that for quite a long time, has changed dramatically. Not just in terms of driving, but in terms of work, in terms of social things that they're allowed to do, the end of the guardianship rules, the mixing in restaurants, the educational opportunities. Many things have changed. And when you think about that in relationship to what's happening in Afghanistan, a country where we spent billions of dollars and thousands of lives, and they're now going the other way, where Saudi Arabia, we didn't spend any money, and we certainly haven't had any Americans killed there for some time. They're going in the right direction. So I would argue that looking at this as a whole, we should put the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi and the jailing of dissidents, of which there are relatively few, in perspective. And I don't mean to sound like an apologist. I'm sure there are people who will say that that's a very apologist thing to say about the Saudis. But when you look at the changes that Mohammed bin Salman has made, he has in fact had to, if you will, he has arrested dissidents on both the left and the right. And it must make for an interesting conversation in the prison cafeteria, but he has put radicals on the left or dissidents of the left and right in prison because the changes he's making, he's enforcing and pushing. So that's a long answer to the question about human rights. I think there are a lot of countries in the world that we have good relationship with that have far worse human rights records in Saudi Arabia, and that rather than penalize them and make them a pariah, we ought to try and encourage them to continue many of the changes that they are in fact already making. That's my one answer, and I'll just quickly one more, and then I'll let Michael chat because there's quite a few questions. But basically, I think the person who raised the issue of the Belt and Road was absolutely right. That's important. China is expanding. We should have talked about that. China has a military base, a naval base in Djibouti at the mouth of the Red Sea. China is expanding, they're building a big port in Pakistan. So they're becoming a lot closer physically than they were in the past. And quite frankly, so is Russia, because Russia now, for many years after the Cold War, was not really a player in the Middle East. They're now back. They're in Syria, they're in Libya. So yeah, I think that's another aspect, the physical presence of both of those in the Middle East, both those two countries.
Michael. So building off what David just said, his last remark, Russia too is much more present in the region, just as China. The Chinese have the base on the mouth of the Red Sea. The Russians, on the other hand, have for the first time in their history a solid hold on a major warm water port on the Mediterranean. And thanks to their control of the Black Sea, control which will only be increased if Putin succeeds in taking all of Ukraine's Black Sea coastline, which he seems to be doing. This morning, there were landings reported at both Mariupol on the eastern side of the Ukraine's Black Sea coast and at Odessa on the western side. It looks like that's what he's going for. He's already got the central salient in Crimea nailed down. The Black Sea will become essentially a maritime highway for Russia to connect to its warm water port in the eastern Mediterranean on the Syrian coast. Syria is seen in much of the Arab world now, certainly in the Gulf, as something of a Russian client state. The Russian role there is more important than the Iranian role. The Russians have handled the Iranians in a masterful way, allowing them to provide pretty much cost-free benefits to Russia as it subjugated Syria. Syria is now a client state. And that, I think, underlines a really important point we need to understand about Russia and its neo-imperial strategy in general. They're not trying to recreate the Soviet Union. Putin was a KGB agent. He understands the internal flaws of the Soviet Union very well. In his several speeches over recent days, he's referred to them in great detail. So for connoisseurs of Russian history, it's actually kind of fascinating to hear a former KGB agent and the current president discuss with such frankness the flaws that brought the Soviet Union down. He's trying to create a new Russian empire. This empire will be designed very differently from the old Soviet empire or the old Russian empire. It's very much a different construction. We could talk for hours about it, but certainly he's back in the Middle East in a way he wasn't before, with his domination of both the Black Sea and his presence in the Eastern Mediterranean. Turning quickly to the other elephant in the room, the imminent completion of the nuclear negotiations in Vienna. If the talks, as seems likely, produce an agreement that the Saudis think essentially opens the way for Iran to emerge as a nuclear weapons state, and that's clearly their worry, the near future will hold a major episode of nuclear proliferation in the Middle East, beginning in the Gulf, possibly also including Turkey. Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE have all the technological ability they need to build and field ballistic missile systems and to build and maintain modest arsenals of nuclear weapons. The technology is out there. The basic understanding of what it takes to build a nuclear bomb is rather widespread. The uranium enrichment technology is somewhat challenging, but not beyond the technical capabilities of any of these countries. And then there's the role of Pakistan, whose own nuclear weapons program was largely funded by the Saudis. So I think we need to understand that if we actually help to bring about a new nuclear agreement with Iran, the JCPOA 2.0, if it doesn't meet the security interests of our Gulf partners and the Turks, I think we're looking at a new round of nuclear proliferation, which will really dramatically change the balance of power in the region. No question about it, and lead to a very unstable correlation of forces in the Gulf.
Thank you, Michael. Wow.
I'll talk on one last. Well, I'll just quickly. What else to turn to?
Right.
Yeah, there was one very quick one. The others we could talk about for a long time, but the question of trust. I think someone asked an interesting question about trust. No, the Saudis don't trust us. They haven't trusted us for a long time. They know very well how we dealt with the Shah, how we dealt with Mubarak. As long as their interests and ours align, they will stay with us. There is as Dr. Anthony pointed out, there is a very deep visceral affection between many Saudis and the United States, but that's not something you're going to build your foreign policy on. And as Dr. Anthony said, it is something that is fading, again, in part for our own fault, because we made it difficult for a long time for Saudis to come to the United States because of visa issues, and because they have developed alternative places that they would like to go to school. So that is a fading. It's not going away, but it is less pronounced than it once was. But in terms of question of trust, it's rather like Ronald Reagan said, trust and verify. So I think that they trust us as long as they can verify.
To either of you, or both, the implications for the U.S. defense and aerospace industries. whereby a device manufactured in the few thousands of dollars was able to evade the most advanced system of defense and deterrence with regard to Patriot missiles and anti-ballistic missiles, that it didn't work. Now, put ourselves or yourselves in the shoes of one of the Fortune 100 companies that markets defense and aerospace equipment, technology, devices, services, maintenance, follow-on. Your credibility has been vitiated in the eyes of some. What are the, you can take that premise and challenge it, if you will, acknowledge it, if you will, and be aware and appreciative of it, if you will, or knock it down and indicate what are the implications, because this is an American industry that employs millions of American citizens and follow-on capacities as well as directly.
I'll be very quick because Mike, I want Mike to answer that, but all I would say very quickly in 2 sentences is that the balance between offense and defense is always changing, and this drone is a new technology. We will develop something to counter it, but in the meantime, the effective technologies that you're talking about are still necessary. If you didn't have those, they wouldn't need drones. They would attack you with airplanes and other larger missiles. And so those systems are still valuable. It's just that there is now a new offensive weapon that you need to think about how to counter. But I'll leave it to Mike to talk about that. He's far more knowledgeable than I am about military matters.
So, I mean, we have to recognize and respect the Iranians' tremendous skill at using asymmetric warfare in all its forms. And the development of these drones launched from Houthi-controlled Yemen and elsewhere is a classic example of that. As Dr. Anthony accurately pointed out, they don't cost much. They're much cheaper than a Patriot missile system or a Patriot missile for that matter, and certainly much cheaper than a fighter aircraft. And yet there is really no effective defense yet against drone attacks, except for the recently developed Russian Pantsir system, which they developed largely to protect their airbase in Syria against drone attacks there, launched by insurgent forces. It's a pretty effective system. It uses both electromagnetic pulse technology, which we're experimenting with in this country, and a kinetic approach, and advanced radars to take down drone targets. I don't believe the Russians are trying to export that system yet. But we in the United States have a lot of catch-up ball to play in terms of working on drone defense. We've been very good at developing both ISR and attack drones, not so good at developing drone defenses. We were thinking only about, the aggressive use of drones and not defensive measures, and we need to play catch-up ball with that. Until we do, the Saudis will have to go to Moscow if they want effective defense against drone attacks. And until that happens, of course, they're already cooperating with the Russians in the drone area. But until they can take effective measures, then as the recent attack on ADNOC showed in Abu Dhabi, the Gulf oil industry is hideously vulnerable to Iranian drone attacks. The fear, returning to the JCPOA for a second, is that once Iran's hands are untied to a large extent by a new agreement, perhaps by the subsequent development of nuclear weapons on the part of the Iranians, then sub-nuclear attacks, such as drone attacks, will become more frequent because Iran will be able to secure itself behind its own nuclear shield. So this is the kind of world we're looking at. And this is why there will be intensive work on anti-drone technology in the near future. There has to be.
Related to this, we have a question from Dr. Rob Renfro, Air Force technology, a former participant in one of the National Council's leadership delegations to the Arab region. And he's also been an outstanding graduate of the National Council's Youth Leadership Development Program, otherwise known as the Model Arab League. We have 50,000 graduates of that program. He's one of the most stellar of the lot. And he wonders about the impact, potential or otherwise, of the situation in Ukraine and what the United States will be doing or not doing to help the Ukrainians with regard to foreign military sales to Saudi Arabia. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars hanging in the balance there. How would one best perceive and analyze the implications of that from Dr. Renfro? I'll let that question stand on its own, and then we'll come back to others. And we're going to go to 11:15. The number of questions are so numerous and so varied and so relevant and rich that the subject matter itself deserves this extension. Who would like to go first on that last one?
Go ahead, Michael. That deals with political military matters.
Right. Well, in terms of military assistance to Ukraine, I think the war that began this morning will be relatively quick if the Russians get their way. And so this may become an academic issue within the next 6 weeks to 2 months. I think the Russian strategy is clearly a blitzkrieg strategy. Last night, they attacked on a very broad front, all the way from the Belarusian border down to Kharkiv in the east and down to Odessa in the south. So I would expect that the facts on the ground there will change very, very rapidly. The Russian forces vastly outnumber and overmatch the Ukrainian forces. The Ukrainian forces seem to be fighting rather staunchly, but I don't think they're going to be able to win this confrontation. And Putin has issued very blunt threats in his speech last night, declaring war on Ukraine. Essentially, he warned foreign whom we did not name by name, that if they were to interfere in this conflict, he would impose costs and consequences on them that they cannot imagine and that they have never experienced in the past. So that's a clear reference, in my opinion, to implicit threat to impose strategic consequences on foreign powers that interfere in what he's hoping will be a quick war to dominate eastern and southern Ukraine. I think if he wins, and he probably will, then the attractiveness of Russian military exports for countries in the Middle East will increase. There's already a great deal of interest in Russian aircraft, SU variety in particular, bombers and fighters, because of his success in defending the Assad regime in Syria. A quick victory in Ukraine in what is the largest military conflict in Europe since World War II will increase his prestige. And by comparison, NATO's inability to defend Ukraine and our recent disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan will cast us in a negative light. So I think we're not going to lose our defense markets in the Gulf. They're too closely tied to American technology, but the Russians will be very attractive after this is all over. I should mention as well that the city of Kharkiv in eastern Ukraine, which I visited many years ago, when it was a center of the Soviet defense industry, it's only 20 miles from the border with Russia. Russian troops crossed the border last night and are now heading to Kharkiv. If they capture Kharkiv, they'll capture the heart of the Ukrainian defense industry. And as we all know, Ukraine has been a major arms exporter to a number of Middle Eastern countries over the years. And its productive capacity will now be added to the Russian defense machine. So that's what I see happening in the near term.
Well, thank you for that. Timely is possible and immediately relevant as well. Food for thought and thought for food there. We're all three of us old enough or young enough. Some days it's hard to determine which is the more valid reality than the other. But what does one say to those who will point out that what Russia has done to Ukraine is a carbon copy, not that distant echo of what Saddam Hussein's Iraq did to Kuwait on August the 2nd, 1990. And secondly, the sort of moralistic or idealistic or altruistic Achilles heel for China with regard to its treatment of the Uyghurs, the Islamic population of China in the far western reaches of the country. We have this problem, do we not, ourselves, where we're seen as hypocritical where we're seen as having double standards, where we're seen as not saying always what we mean, and for sure not meaning always what we say. Who would like to tackle that and link it to there being no American ambassador in Riyadh, the implications of that in comparison with what the Chinese on one hand and the Russians on the other are doing with regard to these interlinked issues? Either of you.
Well, there are three questions there.
Yes.
If I heard it correctly. And I think that the question about there being no ambassador is a significant one. It no doubt reflects priorities in the Senate, probably, and I don't know this, but probably confirming judges is more important than confirming ambassadors, and so they're using their time in that way. But it does send a signal that the United States is not terribly interested in its relationship with Saudi Arabia. That's a statement that has been amplified repeatedly. There are people in the administration who have said that Mohammed bin Salman is a killer. They've said that Saudi Arabia is a pariah state. So you ask, do they trust us? Well, it's sort of, I think, questionable. Now, these things are often said in political contexts, and the Saudis are not naive. They understand what people say on a campaign speech is often, as you pointed out, you may not necessarily mean what you say. And there certainly has been a continuation of arms sales to Saudi Arabia. And I think that there's increasingly a recognition that some of the rhetoric, some of the anti-Saudi rhetoric needs to be toned down. This is the question now of whether they're going to, and they may have done it already, I don't know, I haven't seen lately, but the question of how they're going to regard the Houthis,
yes.
Who the Saudis consider to be, an enemy, and who have attacked them numerous times. Of course, they've attacked the Houthis as well. So I'm not saying that, and I'm not taking sides in their fight, but the Saudis feel that they're being attacked and they need support. And the point I'm making is that so far we have supported them to some extent, not perhaps as much as they would want. So I think the answer to your question, the fact that there is no ambassador is simply one more factor that they look at when they see a stated policy of getting out of the Middle East and focusing on Asia, which is something that numerous administrations have said. So I think those are issues that that affect the way that they look at their relationship with the United States, which is perhaps fading or at least becoming less important than the emerging relationships with China and Russia. And then I'll let Mike answer the next one, which we probably forgot what it was.
No, the Uyghurs.
No, the Uyghurs, yeah.
Just with Kuwait.
Well, the Uyghur issue has been studiously ignored really by Saudi Arabia to a very large extent because, going back to our main subject of this new triple alliance, it's a very pragmatic alliance. It's based on the Saudi need for stable export markets, Chinese need for stable access to energy resources, the Saudi-Russian competition to supply the energy needed to fuel China's rise, and Riyadh's need for alternatives to the U.S. in terms of certain defense technology. So these pragmatic, very unromantic, very, brass tacks interests at this point are certainly outweighing the human rights issues posed by the Chinese oppression of the Uyghurs. The Saudis tend to view it, to the extent that they talk about it at all, as a counterterrorism measure on the part of the Chinese. And of course, given their own problems with Al-Qaeda at the beginning of this century, which David and I are very familiar with, having been there at the time and assisting the Saudis in terms of security assistance at the time against Al-Qaeda, given their own history of problems with terrorist organizations, they tend to be looking at it through that lens rather than a human rights lens.
Yeah, I'll just add one thing, and I think this is pretty much the last comment from me. the United States, and this goes back to my comment on human rights, the United States has placed a very high premium on our ideals and our ideology and exporting, if you will, almost in a missionary sense, our values, which include not only human rights, but gay rights, women rights, trans rights, all sorts of things, which are perhaps not welcome in some Arab countries. Whether that's good or bad, it's simply a fact. The whole essence of this conversation is to point out that the unipolar world that existed with the fall of the Soviet Union, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the replacement of a bipolar world with a unipolar world where we had no peer competitors, where we could pretty well write our own playbook and ignore realpolitik, that is coming to an end. Peer competitors are emerging. New axes of oil energy are emerging. And we're going to have to balance, as I said earlier, our interests with our values, perhaps in a slightly different way than we've done it before, or at least for the last couple of decades.
As a follow-on to this, David and Michael, Iran, a bit more elaboration on that, please. China has gone beyond conviction. It's at the level of commitment of $400 billion for promised infrastructure assistance to Iran. How is the United States likely to finesse this? How are Saudi Arabia and the GCC countries in East Arabia likely to finesse this growing linkage between Iran and China, the ongoing linkages between Russia and Iran, and the dream still of Peter the Great and Catherine the Great of a warm water port, the ideal one being in Iran, with greater access to Iran's 19 ports in the Gulf from the western border of Pakistan all the way up to the eastern border of Iraq. This is almost a dream come true, but it's a dream in a theater coming to a picture show near you. How is one likely to finesse this, manage it, or just analyze and assess its implications, which on the surface appear to be wearisome? Either one.
Well, I'll just jump in quickly and say I think there's going to be a strategically very important competition between Russian and Chinese economic interests in Iran. The Russians are already speaking volumes about their interest in coming in and using their expertise in the oil industry, which is vast, to rebuild Iran's oil industry. The Iranians need to boost production for the domestic market and exports as rapidly as they can. And Russians are happy through Rosneft, Lukoil, and their other big companies to come in and lend a hand there. The Chinese, of course, will be competing to do the same thing. The Chinese have a much larger bank account, as it were, far more capital than they can invest. The Russians have a lead in terms of oil technology. The Russians, of course, have had a strong defense relationship with Iran for years. They'll try to build on that. They'll look at Iran as a market for advanced Russian weapon systems. There they'll have the leg up over the Chinese. And the Chinese will be trying to expand the Belt and Road Initiative to include Iran as a key link in the chain on the Persian Gulf because of those 19 ports. But what they might be missing is the fact that Iran sees itself not as a client state of either Russia or China. It intends to play both off against each other and against the EU. U.S. companies will be largely excluded from this game, of course, because of our history over the last 40 years with Iran. But the key thing to remember here is that Iran sees itself as an empire that unjustly has lost many of its provinces. Iran sees its rightful sphere of influence as extending from Herat in Western Afghanistan to the Mediterranean. And Iran will be using, and to the Arabian Peninsula, Persian Gulf, of course. So Iran will be using this new income it hopes to gain after the signing of the JCPOA it'll be investing this money in expanding its strategic presence and capabilities to build up this its own neo-imperial structure. And that means that it'll inevitably bump up against the rising Chinese and Russian neo-empires as well. So there's going to be a kind of a great block tectonic shifts, if you will, between the Chinese, the Russian, and the Iranian spheres of influence.
David, you want to add to that?
Nope, I made my last comment. I think the switch of from a bipolar world to a unipolar world to a multipolar world is what's going to drive the changes in the Gulf. And just to quickly state that what the Saudis, Mike was exactly right. The Saudis, you would think, as the champions of Muslims around the world, would be saying something about the Uyghurs, but they are not.
Yes.
Because they're being pragmatic and they understand who is their biggest customer and they're being practical.
Yes.
Anyway.
I'll build a little on that. Previously, having been a member of the sanctions subcommittee of the Secretary of State's International Economic Policy Advisors. And when the JCPOA came into existence, there was euphoria, especially among EU countries, that they could see this market enhancing the export economies of the EU countries. And also looking at Iran from a customer perspective, that on the population front of the 8 countries in the Gulf, 7 Arabs, 1 Iranian, Iran's population and its customer base is greater than all the 7 Arab countries combined. So you can see how the continuity of opportunity was very seductive there. But as a member of the Sanctions Committee, a brilliant strategic device was introduced whereby the word went out to the primarily Western-based financial system to not necessarily return the calls of the banks for financial assistance on the loan side, on the debit side, on the deficit side. And the EU companies were faced and forced to come to grips with the reality. Do they want to irritate their markets in the United States, 330 million people, or do they want to favor the $90 million people market of Iran? They chose to favor the former. And on the sanctions aspect here, what is the likelihood of the Western financial or the international financial system, for that matter, accommodating the financial investment needs that Iran has? Looking at China, Iran has, looking at Russia, when that JCPOA 2.0 kicks in to reality. Either of you. How is the Western or the international financial system likely to react and accommodate or resist? If they resist, they further the alternate reserve currency.
The answer is I don't know, because we don't know what the new agreement's going to be. So I'd have to read the agreement before I could see what the sanctions are, before you could make any intelligent or informed comment about how the people will react to it.
I would only
so
add
I'm sorry,
to that
I don't mean to sidestep the question, but until I see the agreement, it's hard to say how people are going to react to it.
All right.
Yes. I would only add that, you know, the war in Ukraine is going to is already producing a major oil price shock, which will throw much of the world into recession this year, and presumably make funds a little bit harder to access than they would have been otherwise. There will be big economic changes this year because of the large and long-lasting boost in energy prices, which will last to the end of the year. And that's going to increase the likelihood of renewed recession here at home as gas prices go north of $5 a gallon and stay there, not to speak of Europe, of course. So yes, that's going to be a major factor. We won't be able to escape that.
We're at time, time here, and I would ask any listener or viewer and challenge any listener or viewer to rake through the published media, magazines, newspapers, and the talk shows on the evening news or throughout the day on the nonstop news. If you will find as broad a range of expertise and analysis and mental acuity with regard to some of the most pressing issues, not just of the day, but thus far of this quarter century. Thank you for viewing. Thank you for listening. And please join me in thanking our two superb specialists and foreign affairs practitioners who brought together a lifetime of focus on these issues. All the best to everyone. We look forward to the next National Council on U.S. Arab Relations cerebral massage.